This is Here's How, Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast, presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading episode 92 of Here's How for the 25th of September 2019. The Data Protection Commission has ruled that a whole range of actions from the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection over the Public Services Card are illegal. What's that all about? Let's talk to an expert in data protection.
Here's How is Ireland's political, social and current affairs podcast. Make your view heard. Just dial 076 603 5060 and tell the world what you're thinking. Your voicemail may be included in the next podcast. You can find tips on recording your contribution and other ways to contact the show at here'show.ie/call.
And coming up for you in this podcast...
They're saying, we have different legal opinion. We have very, very strong legal advice that says otherwise. We're not going to show you our legal advice. It goes to another school. It lives in Canada. You've never met them. But we're not going to listen to your decision.
That's coming up shortly, but first I want to thank all my donors on Patreon, especially Dermot Hayes, who signed up as a patron since the last podcast. I really appreciate all the donors. Patreon is a website that allows people to donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, and that helps me to devote more time to research and to finding interesting guests. If you think that you could do the same as Dermot and the other donors, there's details on the website and at the end of the show. It's probably just dumb luck, but I made two pretty accurate predictions about the Byzantine machinations over the Brexit deal, or non-deal, in British politics. Firstly, back on the 9th of May, before the first of the three House of Commons votes on Theresa May's failed deal to leave the EU, I pointed out that that single vote meant that she was finished. The defeat was, as turned out to be the case, too big for her to overturn, and no Prime Minister could long outlive such a defeat, and that this outcome led inextricably to a takeover by a hardline Brexiteer, David Davis, Dominic Raab, Sajid Javid, or most likely Boris Johnson, and thereby a very hard Brexit. Then, on the 21st of May, as the polls were showing that the Brexit Party would perform strongly in the European elections, at the expense of the Conservatives, I predicted that would influence the election of the new Conservative leader and make it certain that whoever took the hardest Brexiteer line would win. 2 weeks later, May announced her only slightly voluntary intention to resign, and 6 weeks after that, Johnson was elected on a platform of saying that he would prefer to be dead in a ditch rather than delay Brexit past Halloween. And his half-hearted efforts to play the role of someone involved in serious negotiations haven't fooled anyone. Now we have the UK Supreme Court ruling that his efforts to close down Parliament and prevent those pesky MPs from interfering with his cunning plans are illegal. So what's going to happen next, Mystic Meg? Is there going to be a deal, a no-deal Brexit, or no Brexit at all? Well, my crystal ball is a bit cloudy, but it's worth noting the entry of the supposed political mastermind, Dominic Cummings, into Downing Street along with Johnson. This is the guy portrayed by Benedict Cumberbatch in the Brexit film for Channel 4. He, as with Johnson and the haunted pencil himself, Jacob Rees-Mogg, have reputations for being terribly clever, Daddy having paid for Eton and Oxford and all that. But here's the thing. They all come from inherited wealth. They all have fantastically educated views about the world. But unlike other politicians, they haven't had to fight for their power terribly hard. Dominic Cummings has never even joined a political party. Mogg was gifted a seat in the west of England, although I think he commutes into Westminster from the 18th century, and Johnson made his reputation in the media before becoming a celebrity mayor of London. None of them worked their way up the greasy political pole as local councillors or fighting for a nomination in a winnable seat. They might see that as beneath them, but that type of apprenticeship into politics is not without value. At the very least, it teaches you the first rule of politics: learn how to count. Johnson has shown himself sorely lacking in that department. Spectacularly, he has lost every single one of the 6 votes he had in Parliament since he became Prime Minister. To put that in context, with a very thin majority, John Major only lost 6 votes in the whole 7 years that he was in office, and Blair and Thatcher only lost 4 each. It didn't help that Johnson expelled 21 members of his party for voting against their own government, something that he did himself regularly before he became PM. But for all his bad moves, that last one might not be as stupid as it seems. He is clearly eyeing the position after an election. The best case scenario might be that he would win a narrow majority, and if that happens, he wants a party of loyalists. So getting rid of the troublemakers before the election and replacing them with yes-men is a sharp move. But he has to get to an election first, and everything rides on whether that comes before or after the 31st of October, and whether and how Brexit happens on that date. Johnson's one bit of luck is that his opponents are hopelessly divided, and the main opposition, the UK Labour Party, is hopelessly divided amongst itself. So here's my prediction. If the newly reconvened Parliament can prevent a Halloween Brexit, then Johnson's fox is shot. His unique selling point is a dud, and there is likely to be an election very soon after in which he is wiped out. If he manages to implement a Halloween Brexit, he's on a very short fuse. He needs to have an election almost immediately. For him, the ideal date would be Brexit Day itself, the 31st of October. That's conveniently a Thursday, the traditional day for elections in the UK. But that's almost impossibly tight timing now. The law requires a minimum of 5 weeks' notice for the election. If the election was in the weeks after a no-deal Brexit, the situation is very unstable, but not good for Johnson. A November election is likely to be competing for news headlines with all the disruption of a no-deal Brexit. Again, toxic. Again, a toxic option for the Conservatives. That means that getting a deal is suddenly in Johnson's interests, particularly one with a long transition period, not unlike the deal that May got, which he voted against twice. But the chances of getting anything that both the EU and the ultra-Brexit MPs can agree is so remote that it's hardly worth considering. So what's going to happen? 2 things: delay and unending chaos.
Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you want your point of view heard, dial 076 603 5060 and leave a contribution for the show. The lines are open 24/7 and you can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
On a Skype line now, I have the Director of Training and Research at a company called Castlebridge. She's a specialist in training people how to process and use data correctly. She's also the author of a book called Ethical Data and Information Management: Concepts, Tools and Methods. Catherine O'Keefe, you've been tweeting and commenting a lot about the Public Services Card. I want to have a look at that, but first of all, just to look at your job. In terms of data protection, what is that? Why does that exist in the first place?
One of the reasons we have what we call data protection is that whenever you use information about people, you have the potential to do things that would harm them or would violate their rights. So, for instance, one of the easy things to look at is the right to privacy. Mm-hmm. If you take pictures of people in a public place, or if you aim your webcam in somebody's window, that gets pretty creepy. It violates the right to privacy. But data protection is looking at all of our fundamental human rights under the Charter of Fundamental Rights and saying that if you're going to do things with information about people, you have to make sure you follow certain conditions so that you're not abusing their rights.
Okay, give me an example of something that might be.
Okay, so one example of processing data in a reasonable, proportionate way would be you've been processing contact information about me, like my email address, my phone number, and some scheduling information so that we could make an appointment to record this podcast. Mm-hmm. But if you went beyond that to find out my home address, the full schedule of my day, and track my location out the week, that would be creepy and illegal. But you're not a stalker, so you didn't do that.
No.
Yeah. On the other hand, my mobile phone company does know my home address and my financial information, as well as that contact information, because that's necessary for them to bill me for my mobile phone services as part of a contract that we have. Mm-hmm. They also process location data about my phone because that's necessary for operation on the mobile phone network. But it would be illegal for them to use that same location data to find out where I am so they can send me ads or coupon vouchers for shops near where I am that particular moment, unless I explicitly signed up for that. So you've got various rules making sure that it's proportionate.
Okay, so a person can't then say collecting X information is wrong, collecting Y information is right, because it depends on the context and whether I need that, and also whether the person has given permission for that.
Yeah, so the data protection legislation that we have European legislation and an Irish law that fills in the gaps around that legislation for particular Irish contexts. They set out particular principles and rules that you have to follow to make sure that you're doing things right. So one of the things that we're looking at is what we call lawful processing conditions. So consent is a condition that you can use to process people's data lawfully. Contract is another one. Having the ability to process data because a law says you can to fulfill something in the public interest would be another one. Mm-hmm. So there's basically a number of lawful processing conditions that you can look for. And one of the things that the Data Protection Commissioner was looking at with the Public Services Card is what is their lawful basis for processing the data? Can they actually do it legally?
And to pause you there, just processing the data, that just means doing anything with it.
Yeah, processing means collecting data, it means storing data, it means doing anything at all with the data that you have, and it means deleting data or sharing it with other people or organizations. So pretty much anything you do with data is processing.
Okay, and way back when there was this, what has become the Public Services Card, was originally issued, I think actually in the late 1990s. And how has that developed? What did that become? What's the story of what happened to that?
So there is legislation, the Social Welfare Act of 2005 is the one that we've been working with. It's been amended several times, which sets out the ability for the Department of Social Protection, can't remember what it was at the time. I think it was Department for Social Welfare at the time. It's got name changed several times over, to satisfy themselves as to the identity of the people that are applying for social welfare benefit. So the way it's described in the legislation, it says the minister may satisfy themselves as to the identity of the person who is verifying their identity. Basically,
that's reasonable enough. You want to know who you're paying the money to.
Absolutely. And so that's one of the things where we're not saying that you can't allow people to say, okay, I need to check sure you actually are who you say you are, because that is a reasonable and proportionate thing to do. However, the way there was actually I can't remember what the name of the card was before the Public Services Card, but it was a social benefit card that was used for that purpose. Mm-hmm. The Public Services Card itself is a way that the department has decided they're going to use to verify the identity of people. And one of the things that they keep on talking about is this SAFE-2 standard, a safe identification framework, which is something completely different than a piece of plastic.
Tell me what that is.
Yeah, so the safe identification framework is a standard that the Irish government decided would be a way that they decided what level of confidence they had that you are who you say you are. So SAFE 2 is there's basically SAFE 1, 2, 3, and 4. SAFE 2 is the standard that they're talking about for the public services card. And it's basically showing up with a identification document and some supporting identification that shows your proof of address and a couple other bits and bobs like you always have to do when you're applying for anything.
Like when you go into a bank account, they want a proof of address and 2 recent bills or something like that.
Yeah, so that basically, it's a pretty standard form of, okay, here's our level of certainty that you aren't actually pretending to be someone else.
Mm-hmm. You don't have to put your hand on a fingerprint scanner as you would have to do perhaps if you want to launch nuclear bombs.
Yeah. So the idea with the SAFE 2 is that you have a specific form of surety that you are who you say you are. And that, again, the legislation provides for that because that's the level of surety that the minister has decided is okay. Where we start getting a little bit weird and where I think in some cases the Data Protection Commissioner with their findings is actually being a bit generous to the department is the legislation doesn't actually say that if you go through this is ridiculous legal analysis. There's the minister may do something or the minister shall do something. Mm-hmm. So those 2 words are really, really important for legal interpretation. And when it comes to data protection, what we're looking at is it necessary to do something to complete a purpose. If the necessity is to satisfy the minister to that particular standard that you are who you say you are. What is the difference between having a public services card and having your birth certificate and 2 utility bills, so on and so forth, showing up with those? So that's, again, my own personal question. The Data Protection Commissioner isn't even getting to that. They're saying, okay, the department can say you need to use a public services card in order to apply for social welfare benefit because there's enough wiggle room in the legislation to say, okay, it's necessary to do that.
Okay, to bring that to what maybe more ordinary people can understand, the law essentially says we need this level of security. The public services card
the law
provides
says the
that.
department can decide a standard of security. The public services card is how they've decided to do that.
Yeah, and they've decided that level. And the Data Protection Commission, who we've had on this podcast previously, who explain why they want to, a little bit like you, protect people's data because there's the possibility not only of privacy violations, but of all sorts of other bad things happening to you, particularly in the online world that we're in. The department and other government departments, having created this card, then wanted to massively increase its scope and its use. And the Data Protection Commission took an interest in that. Was that on the foot of a complaint, or did they do that off their own bat?
Both. So since the 90s on the previous Data Protection Commissioner, the Office of the Data Protection Commission has been incredibly concerned about the risks that's involved with this type of a project. So again, if you think about the public services card, we don't actually care very much about the piece of plastic. We care about what's going on behind that piece of plastic, how data is being used, what it's being used for, how it's being saved, what you're actually doing with it. So you've got your piece of plastic. You've also got a database on the back end and who has access to it, who's allowed to be using it, all those concerns. One of those concerns is this idea of function creep. Now, the Irish government since the 90s has had kind of a digital strategy that they want to do things, but that doesn't mean there's necessarily put it into law. And over multiple situations, not just the public services card, but if you remember one of the controversies with the Irish Water sign-up situation was that Irish Water was demanding the public PPSNs of everyone in a household on the application for the billing.
Essentially the number from that card.
Yeah. So the PPSN is slightly different again. Again, the PPSN has been around for a longer time, but it's been used as essentially an identifying number. But Irish Water didn't have a lawful basis to do so. So that's while a government memo had said, okay, we can do this, there wasn't a law that let them do this, so they had to stop.
Okay, so let me translate that into more basic speak that I can understand, and tell me if I'm right. Essentially, there is this level of going along and proving your identity with recent bills and with so forth. And if Irish Water come along and say, you don't get water unless you can prove this, that is a disproportionate use of data and illegal processing of the data in the database in the back end of that card. Am I right on that?
That's correct. So they don't have the right to ask for that data. They don't have a lawful basis to ask for that data. They can't do it. So it's not just disproportionate, but they don't have a lawful basis to do that.
Okay, so there has to be a law saying here you're allowed to do this within the data protection realm, and it didn't exist. They just sort of decided that they'd do it, and they say, we're in charge and don't be bothering us with all those laws.
Yeah.
What then did the Data Protection Commission rule? They issued a ruling recently, and what was their attitude towards the department's behaviour on this?
Okay, so that's a big question, and what was the Data Protection Commissioner looking at is a humongous question because they've actually only released part one of the report.
Okay.
So basically, what the Data Protection Commissioner was looking at is, does the department have a lawful purpose to do that thing that they're doing? Is doing the thing that they're doing with people's data necessary to complete their purpose, and is it proportionate? Do people understand what's happening to the data that's being processed about them? And are they keeping data longer than they need to? So those were the four questions, basically, that the Data Protection Commissioner was looking at. And so the first part of that question, the legal question, first part was, can the Department for Employment Affairs and Social Protection demand that you use a specific form of identification to verify your identity to a particular standard? So that's a public services card and SAFE 2 when claiming for social welfare benefits. And the DPC decided yes to that. The second half of the legality question is, can other government and public bodies also demand that you use that same public services card or SAFE 2 registration? And here the Data Protection Commissioner said, no, there isn't a basis in the legislation for other organizations that are not the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. And if you don't have a lawful basis to do the thing, you can't do it.
Pause on that then for a second.
Yeah.
So what essentially they said, and we maybe compare it to going into a bank, that if you have established by going in with your utility bills and blah, yada yada, and you get this piece of plastic, the Department of Social Welfare can say, we don't want you coming in with your utility bills and everything every time you're picking up your dole payment or your children's allowance or whatever. We want you just to come with this card because we have recorded your identity with that. But if you want then to go and borrow a library book, or you want to have some other interaction with the state that isn't to do with social welfare, the government can't say you must use that card. And maybe that might be analogous with, once the bank gives you a bank account, you get a bank card, and the bank can use that to access your account. But the video shop down the street, if they still exist, can't demand to see a specific bank card because they want to know your identity only with that. Would that be a good analogy?
Yeah. So another analogy, just keeping it to government services, the Road Safety Authority built a system that would require you to sign up for a driver's test using the public services card. A year ago, they got legal advice saying, oh, maybe you shouldn't actually go live with that because you don't have a lawful basis to demand that. You can't say, oh, no, you can't show us your passport. We need to see the public services card. The Department of Foreign Affairs, despite the fact that their standard of figuring out who you are and verifying your identity in order to get a passport, was starting to demand using the public services card to renew your passport when that would suggest that their own standard for verifying you are who you say you are isn't sufficient. And that would cause an extra barrier for people who don't have a public services card but do have a passport that needs renewing.
So did the Department of Foreign Affairs go ahead with that, or did they cancel that? What happened? What was the outcome there?
So they did originally go ahead with it, but they have now canceled that after this ruling from the Data Protection Commissioner deciding that they don't actually have a lawful basis to demand that.
Okay, and there were several other government departments. I know that one was involved at the Department of Education in terms of school transport, was demanding that as well. Was the fear behind that essentially what the government was trying to do was create a national identity card by stealth?
That's definitely one of the things that people who are very concerned about the idea of having a national identity card and some of the risks involved with that's what they were concerned about. Personally, I don't have necessarily a problem with the idea of a national identity card, but you have to do it right, and you have to do it legally, and you have to make sure you have a democratic discussion about it, and it's done on a lawful basis and properly designed.
The other thing that strikes me as important with that is that when you then have a database behind that card, who has access to what? Because if somebody, you're going to the official who is issuing your passport, or you're applying for a library card or whatever, is the person who's tapping away behind the desk able to see your social welfare record, your record from all of those? And I remember the case, I've mentioned it before, of the woman in Limerick who won a very large amount on the Euro Millions, and it was revealed that more than 100 public servants in the days when her name was in the news looked up her social welfare records. Is one of the problems there that we haven't had any discussion as to who's allowed to see what?
Internally and on the back end, there has been a lot of discussion, but there hasn't necessarily been enough risk assessment. And that question of not just who has access to the database, but how you put the database together, where you get data from, how you protect it, and how do you make sure that it is accurate, up to date, all these important questions. That has to be done before you start merging databases from, for instance, the Department of Social Protection, Children and Youth Affairs, the Department of Agriculture. One of the strategies that the government has been looking at is having this idea of a single view of customer for all citizens and residents of the state. And that's something that is in a investigation to come. So, this investigation covered 4 main things: the safe registration, what's called the PSI data set, single customer review database, and the MyGov ID online registration. But that investigation got so big that the Data Protection Commissioner just looked at the public services card and the Safe 2 registration. So we've got a whole lot more to come. We've got questions about, is the department processing biometric data and using face matching or face recognition? If so, do they have a lawful basis to do that? So that is going to be still to come in a following report. And those are going to be the really scary and interesting questions. This particular one is not even there yet.
We saw a little while back on this podcast how Regina Doherty, who's the minister in question, was touchy, to put it at its very mildest, about criticism in relation to this. She denied in a radio interview. In fact, I've got a clip here. I will play the clip when she was asked about whether this was containing biometric information.
Well, then, yes, we have the photograph. But I don't believe that having a simple photograph is actually biometric data.
And the newsworthy Twitter handle, which puts out things like this, did a little bit of research and put together a couple of clips from the Oireachtas, where people such as the previous minister, Joan Burton, and also the secretary of the department gave a different answer to that question.
I understand when they're taking the picture, there's a mathematical kind of where they measure points and things.
It's actually biometric.
Biometric. So that's not...
The personal services card is a card with a biometric standard photograph. When we sign somebody up for that, we also take an electronic signature.
And the difficulty with those is that when you have all of that information, and correct me if I'm wrong, available to everyone who works for the state who might tap in and be doing a very basic data processing role, that it leaves it open to an enormous amount of abuse, both by individuals but also by the state. And we don't want to take even one step down that road to a big brother state, let alone arrive at the destination. Can you maybe then, Catherine, just comment on not so much maybe the report, but the department's reaction to it and what they've been saying about it?
Yeah, before I do that, I'll actually just answer that biometric question because it's very, very, very clear cut from a data protection law perspective. The definition of biometric data in the legislation, in the General Data Protection Regulation, specifically calls out using face matching or face recognition for the purposes of identifying a person as an example of what biometric data is. So no matter what Regina Doherty believes, by definition in the law, what the use of face matching by the department for the purposes of fraud prevention, in order to find out are you who you say you are, which is what she kept on using as why we're doing this, is in fact processing biometric data. So that's going to be, I would expect, extremely clear-cut, open and closed. Yeah, it's biometric. As far as the other concerns, it's a massive concern. What data protection law is looking at is you need to consider what the risk is and figure out is what you want to do, again, necessary and proportionate, and what you can do to minimize risk to people when you're doing the thing. So again, it's not necessarily going to forbid us having a database that has a lot of information about people or a way for various government departments to get the information they need from other departments so you don't have to give it every single time. But it absolutely has to be designed in a very, very careful way so that you don't have a big database that everyone can access. So yeah, we definitely are concerned about that kind of risk. In general, if you put data in a bucket, if you put all your eggs into one basket, you have to be really, 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 really careful about that basket. You don't want to do that. So from a simple data management perspective, having the idea of having a single view of customer, having a single database with all the information in it is incredibly risky and not recommended at all.
Okay, I've been looking at your Twitter thread on this, which I'll link to on the show notes for this podcast on the website. I've also been looking at a Twitter thread from a solicitor called Simon McGarr, and he points out that in the department response that, and this is his, I'm quoting his tweet here, embarrassingly, it turns out welfare, that's the department, literally didn't understand the legal meaning of indiscriminate and argued it favoured them based on that wrong meaning. In other words, it is illegal to retain and process data, as I understand it, for an unstated reason. So in other words, just hang on to it because we might think of a reason that we might need it later on. Am I correct that they have really maybe had a very poor and poorly thought out response to this?
Yeah, I honestly found the response bizarre and shocking. So some of the things that they were saying, for instance, that particular argument that Simon McGarr was pointing out was referring to a European Courts of Justice case on mass surveillance, on the retention of telecoms data for the purpose of looking through it to find terrorists. Which, again, that's a specific purpose to keep the data, but the issue that the European Courts of Justice had was keeping everybody's data in case you might want to find information about a particular terrorist down the line, or So that was kind of the issue. You can't do mass surveillance when you can do targeted surveillance. So keeping everybody's utility bills forever and ever, amen, when your card's only valid for 7 years and you move, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. That is indiscriminate retention of data, even of everyone's data, rather than a targeted person who you think might be committing fraud.
Okay. Also, the department, Simon McGarr noted that the department said that there was no evidence of public unrest or dissatisfaction with this. And the Data Protection Commissioner actually just published a whole list of about 20 bullet points of media stories of really quite serious problems with the card. Do you think that the data protection, what was going through their minds? Were they determined to slap down the department pretty hard?
Again, reading between the lines of the report and the response, despite the fact that the department says they've complied fully with the request, they would have failed what Castlebridge calls the attitude test in interacting with the regulator. You want to be helpful because they're frankly there to make sure that you do it right. They want to help you get it right. Mm-hmm. They tend to have a very amicable resolution way of looking at things. They want to help you do things better rather than immediately slapping you down with fines. But one of the things the department did was take a very long time after receiving the provisional report, the draft report, to respond to it, and they responded with a nearly 500-page long document, unpaginated, so no page numbers, mm-hmm. Unsearchable, and just as someone who reads a lot of documents, that is absolutely ridiculous. That's basically a slap in the face.
This is one of my real bugbears. This is one of my real bugbears with departments. You get PDFs, but they're not PDFs of text. They're PDFs with images of text, so you can't do Control F and find anything in it. Do you get the sense that for all the demands to have searchable information about us, they're not that happy for us to be able to search information about them?
Absolutely. Now, there are some simple logistical problems. They also, if you're doing, for instance, a freedom of information request and trying to get information back that way, mm-hmm. if they have to redact information, they need to make sure you can't do some technological trickery and
if they black it out, they don't want you to be able to unblack it out.
Yeah, so that's fair. And sometimes they just don't have the proper software to do things in a different way. So you have to kind of balance the wanting to get things done and help you and make things transparent and the technical ability to do so. But in many cases, I find that there seems to be an attitude that anyone who asks for this information, despite the fact that it's their right to do so, is wasting their time. And they're again, some people are incredibly helpful, and there's a lot of people doing a lot of very, very good work in the public sector, and I don't want to insult them or talk down the very, very hard work they're doing. But there can often be, particularly in the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection, a very strong culture, company culture problem there.
And one last thing just to finish up, Catherine, where can the department go from here? Should they scrap the whole project?
That would be my recommendation. Of course, my recommendation would have been to make sure you have the things done to do it right first. At the moment, the Data Protection Commissioner has told them these things that you are doing are not lawful. The department is digging in. If they don't agree with the commissioner's decision, they should appeal. Mm-hmm. But they're not appealing the decision. They're just saying, no, we're not going to do that. Make us. And that's, again, a very belligerent type of a response. They're saying, we have different legal opinion. We have very, very strong legal advice that says otherwise. We're not going to show you our legal advice. It goes to another school. It lives in Canada. You've never met them. But we're not going to listen to your decision. When you put an enforcement order, we'll appeal, but they never actually appealed the decision that the Data Protection Commissioner made. So it's undermining the role of the independent regulator who is required by European treaty to be independent. Their job is to say, not only to your Googles and your Facebooks, but to the government. If you're doing something wrong, no, you have to stop. So saying, I'm not going to listen to you, I'm not going to do that, seems to be not a very wise way to respond to things.
They sound a little bit like perhaps a prime minister of a neighbouring country. Catherine O'Keefe, data governance and data protection consultant and trainer at Castlebridge Associates, available, I guess, for private companies as well. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you.
Make your view heard. Record your own contribution and email it to podcast@here'show.ie. You can find tips on how to record a good contribution and other ways to contact the podcast at here'show.ie/call.
Go to the website for sources and references from the show, and while you're there, you can like the show on Facebook, follow the show on Twitter at Here's How Podcast, and follow Dr. Catherine O'Keefe at O'Keefe KAT. And get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. And thanks to Diarmuid and all of the patrons on Patreon, I really appreciate them. It means I can devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, go to patreon.com/here'show. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. All that, including my Patreon link, are at www.here'show.ie. The Here's How podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.